Welcome to the Off the Page podcast. I'm Stephen Copeland. For listeners of Off the Page, it will be no surprise that a pope who took the name Francis would come up often in the Franciscan conversations that are featured on this podcast. This episode is a compilation of both published and unpublished interviews, where guests talk about the life, legacy, and papacy of Pope Francis. Included here is Father Murray Bodo talking about Pope Francis's heart for the poor, Dr. Daniel P. Horan talking about God's love and mercy being a cornerstone to Pope Francis's papacy, Sister Margaret Carney talking about the Pope's unique ability to, much like St. Francis of Assisi, speak the language of the people and make the Catholic faith accessible. Also included is Brother Keith Warner talking about the Franciscan undertones in the Pope's encyclicals, particularly Laudato Si, and this encyclical's lasting call to environmental conversion and what the Pope calls integral ecology. And lastly, the poet Dr. Angela Alaimo O'Donnell discussing the Pope's love for art and literature. I have also included 2 other clips in this episode that are not from off-the-page interviews. This episode begins with a recording from 2021 with Sister Margaret Carney again, where she frames Pope Francis's papacy as one that is uniquely Franciscan. And then this episode concludes with some of Pope Francis's own words about divine mercy, translated and recorded on audiobook in the Franciscan Media title, Believe in Love. This episode admittedly only scratches the surface of Pope Francis's life, papacy, and legacy. But in editing this episode, I thought it was really neat to see how naturally the Pope's impact came up in these conversations. Off the Page has only existed for a year, and yet the Pope's impact was coming up in almost every other episode. So I do encourage you to visit the show notes for this episode, as I hope the clips compiled here may be on-ramps to a deeper dive into Pope Francis's impact on the Church and the world. So what does Pope Francis's life and legacy mean to me? Honestly, I feel a little out of my depth to talk about that. I don't think I'll be able to fully grasp, probably until years down the road, what it was, just how unique it was for me to be spiraling into the Christian mystics and the Franciscan tradition the last decade here at the same time that Pope Francis was leading the church. When he was elected by the College of Cardinals in 2013, I was still pretty deep in the evangelical Christian world. However, I was beginning to engage my doubts about faith and deconstruct my theology, as they say. And I remember his famous "Who am I to judge" line as if it were yesterday. Here was someone I saw who was he was putting love and mercy and acceptance at the forefront of the conversation rather than doctrine, dogma, and the kind of religious dualism I had grown incredibly bored and frustrated with in conservative evangelicalism. So, did Pope Francis lead me to return to my Catholic roots? I don't know. Thomas Merton, Henry Nouwen, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Francis of Assisi, St. Clare of Assisi, they certainly did. But, working with my late mentor, Father Dan Riley, on his book Franciscan Lectio, that certainly did. And Pope Francis is quoted thoroughly throughout that book. But one thing is sure, attending the Franciscan School of Theology and studying the Pope's encyclicals like Fratelli Tutti and Laudato Si, that was an incredible gift that I do not believe I fully grasp. So, like most, I have my own qualms with the Catholic Church, but one thing's certain, returning to my Catholic roots and discovering the expansiveness of Franciscan theology was certainly made easier for me when the person at the head of the church was leading in such a loving, compassionate, and non-dualistic way. And for that, I am incredibly grateful. So rest in peace, Pope Francis. And I pray that we can take this Pope's wisdom and, more than anything, like St. Francis of Assisi, his heart, into our lives and walks of faith. So kicking off this special episode is a 2021 recording featuring Sister Margaret Carney talking about the Franciscan undertones of Pope Francis's papacy.
I hope that Pope Francis impacts every Franciscan living on the planet right now, from the tips of our toes to the crown of our heads. I honestly believe that God has placed him with the grace of this office in the world at this time to summon us to the deepest possible understanding and willingness to be banner bearers of the full mission of Francis for living the gospel and healing the planet and healing humanity. These are the messages: the joy of the gospel, Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti, everything that Pope Francis has committed to as his principal messages to the world are a reflection of the teaching of Francis of Assisi. And I believe that as Franciscans, we should waste not a moment of our time not becoming thoroughly imbued with those teachings, understanding them, analyzing them, reflecting, making applications to our own culture and society, understanding what will be offensive to our culture and society, and how do we reconcile some of that tension. But I really believe that Pope Francis is, in a sense, handing us a charter for what Brian McLaren calls a Franciscan Renaissance. And so, in addition to these great medieval texts and the inspirations of ever so many writings about and by early Franciscan saints, we have a Pope who stands up every day and calls the world to honor the message of Francis. And when you look at the photograph of Pope Francis signing this latest encyclical literally beneath the tomb of St. Francis, how can we mistake the symbolism? He could have signed it in his office in Rome. He is trying to tell us the voice of your father Francis of Assisi is the voice your brother Francis of Rome is trying to make alive again. I think it is so exciting. It is such a blessing for us. With all the stresses and pain we might have, whether tensions within the church, tensions within the politics of our society, he is one brilliantly shining ray of hope for all of us.
I wanted to include that video because I think it really helps to frame this episode. Next is Father Murray Bodo, reflecting on when Jorge Mario Bergoglio took the name Francis when he was elected Bishop of Rome.
I'm so happy and proud to be recording this podcast 2 days after Pope Francis has passed into heaven. He was such an icon and a major figure in my life as a Franciscan and just as an ordinary human being. He was so great. And I was in Assisi when he made his first visit to Assisi, and it was such a thrill to me. They had great big screens all over the city, and I was sitting in front of one of the screens in the evening, and there was an interview with him, and he was talking about how we got the name Francis. And he said that one of the bishops came up and whispered in his ear when they came up to greet him, "Don't forget the poor." And Pope Francis said, "Boom," just like that. He said, "Boom, Francis of Assisi." I knew my name. He hadn't planned on that name before. And of course, hearing that in Assisi, and he just was such a Franciscan at heart. In fact, the Romans that I talked to earlier, the Roman people, they said he has a Jesuit mind and a Franciscan heart, and that's a good combination. And he never called himself Pope. It was always the Bishop of Rome. and he was totally devoted to the people. Shortly after he had been in office, I think it was a month, I was in Rome, and I was in a taxi, and I was rushing to get to a meeting of our pilgrimage programs. And I said to the cab driver, "How do you like your new pope?" Silence. I thought, oh boy, I'm in some political difficulty here or something. And then after about 3 minutes, he said, "No, we don't have a pope. We have a pastor." And that touched me so deeply because they looked upon him as their pastor and he embraced that. That is how he envisioned himself. But he was so Franciscan, even his book, Laudato Si, that's taken from the Canticle of the Creatures, the first words of Francis, "Praise be you, my Lord, Laudato Si, mi Signore." It's just so, it was so wonderful. And what he has done to keep the poor at the foreground of the church is just the dream of every Franciscan heart. And of course, I had all kinds of reasons to love him. He was a northern Italian immigrant to Argentina. My parents were northern Italian immigrants to America. And things he talked about, the Italian things, his sense of joy, I love that. He had a sense of humor. He didn't take himself too seriously. So it's a great loss because he was a force to be reckoned with. In fact, they've made 4 or 5 movies, maybe more. I heard 6 that it could be on his life, and of course the 2 popes, which is a fiction, but a fiction with a lot of truth in it. And so we're going to miss him. I'm going to miss him, but he left a legacy for us not to forget the poor. He just to the end. I think he held on. He was so sick, I thought he was going to die earlier, but I knew he's going to hold on until after Easter, and he's going to make an appearance no matter what it takes. And he did. I would love to be in Rome for the funeral, but I have no doubt, like so many people who are listening to me now, uh, don't worry about that. He'll come and visit you if you want him to. He'll be there for us, and he'll be a great intercessory prayer and person in our lives.
That clip is from a soon to be published episode of Off the Page where I interviewed Father Murray about his new poetry book, Brother Wind and Air. I love that story that Father Murray shared about the cab driver. The quote, "We don't have a pope, we have a pastor." I found that really powerful. So I invite you to take some time with that quote and maybe not only the quote itself, but also the silence from which this quote flowed from. I think that story speaks wonders about Pope Francis's non-hierarchical approach to leadership, even in an institution as hierarchical as the Catholic Church, as well as his down to earth mode of being and ministry. So, next up is a clip from our interview with Dr. Daniel P. Horan, which was published at the beginning of 2025. In this clip, you'll hear Dan and I talk about the difficulty of accepting God's love for us, which led him to reflect on what has been called Pope Francis's mission statement when he was elected Bishop of Rome. Why is it so difficult to accept God's love, in your opinion?
Man, yeah, if I
You
had
have
the
like
answer
an hour
for that,
left, right?
I know, right? Yeah. How many hours do we have? Yeah, well, I often go back to something Pope Francis said in April of 2013. This was when he was newly elected Bishop of Rome, and the actual kind of cathedral of the Diocese of Rome is the Lateran Basilica. And so every new pope, they become pope the night of the conclave and all of this. But then there's a formal kind of installation as the Bishop of Rome, as the Pope, right? And that takes place at the Lateran Basilica, and there is the cathedra, the chair of the bishop there. And so, him celebrating Mass there, sitting in that chair, this is all part of it. And Pope Francis, in that particular liturgy, gave a homily where I and others, I'm not original in thinking this way, have talked about this as kind of Pope Francis announcing his mission statement. And here we can, more than a decade now, look back and see that this is kind of par for the course, which is all about mercy. And I think, to your point, why is it so hard to accept God's love? I think it's because fundamentally we don't believe that we're worthy of it, that we need to do something. And part of that, if not most of that, I think is conditioned by our experience of such qualified love in our human relationships, even those in our families where there might be the closest thing in healthy family relationships to an unconditional love. If we're honest, even that becomes conditioned. We're never 100% sure that something in our life, or a fight that breaks out, a disagreement, a disagreement about perspective or politics, or you name it, wouldn't be the thing, that straw that breaks the camel's back of that relationship. There's always just that edge of the precipice. And so if we take that experience of conditioned love, of qualified love in this life, all we have to talk about God and understand God is our human experiences and language. We know that God is incomprehensible, but yet God is knowable. We can talk about God, but we do so analogously. We do so somewhat removed. And so I think when we're thinking this way, we have no choice, no recourse, but to draw from our experience of human love. I think it's harder for people who have felt an absence of that close to unconditional love. It doesn't mean that even those who have can accept God's love completely. And what Pope Francis says in that homily has always stayed with me. I'm going to paraphrase it here, is that he says, God doesn't actually want anything from you. God is already there. All God wants you to do is turn to God. I've always visualized this as like you're facing one direction and God is like literally standing behind you. You don't have to pay anything. You don't have to do anything, but turn toward God. Just turn around. In the fear that we're going to be rejected or overlooked or minimized or what have you, that we carry with us from our earthly relationships, I think inhibits too many people from just turning. That's all. Pope Francis says, don't, literally, that's it. God will take care of the rest. And how few of us are able to turn around. I know I struggle with that, right? It goes back to the true self. It goes back to Francis of Assisi's notion of who we are before God. And so we're always in a process of becoming more who we are, or maybe, to borrow that Mertonian language, maybe becoming less of who we are in that spirit of the false self. But I do believe that God, I trust what Pope Francis says, God's mercy is there. It's just a matter of us turning to God. It's just a matter of us accepting that love, which to some people sounds, probably like, too theoretical or abstract or too, touchy-feely or what have you. But I think, is that not what Jesus's message was all about? It was made concrete and present by his outreach and his inclusion, his invitation. What does that say to us about how we move through the world? What does it say to us about how we understand ourselves? And I think that combination of Ronner and Merton and Francis and Jesus's own message in the Gospels has invited me to continue to recognize that it's not a one and done, that we're always in a process of becoming. So maybe that's probably a good place to end, because we're continuing to journey forward.
This reflection from Dan Horan about Pope Francis's mission statement leads me to contemplate my own mission statement in life, in leadership, in the day to day. Is God's love and mercy at the foundation of my own mission? And how can the way Pope Francis lived this out inspire and challenge me and us today? This next clip is a brief one from Sister Margaret Carney. This episode was published in February 2025, and the episode really honed in on St. Clare of Assisi's approach to leadership. This led to a really wonderful comment from Sister Margaret about Pope Francis's great skill as a communicator, which is important for any kind of leader. Enjoy.
I heard a wonderful statement yesterday by Gerard O'Connell, a Vatican journalist, who said, Pope Francis is not saying anything different in principle about the economy, the greed of the ultra-rich, the danger to the environment. He said, Benedict said it. John Paul II said it. But Francis uses language ordinary people relate to. And now people are like, did you hear what the Pope said? Well, guess what? It's been said for 25 years. But that's how he disrupts things, because he will use a turn of phrase that you're like, Pope Francis said that, He doesn't speak Vaticanese. He speaks the language of people. And so I think he's a good example in our time of someone with his vast Jesuit education who can relate to the highest levels of authority, but sit with a farmer or a sick child, or a struggling parent and get right in there with them.
This next clip is a lengthier one from Brother Keith Warner, a Franciscan friar, scholar, professor, and author of the award-winning book Care for Creation. In this clip, Brother Keith talks about his own mission and ministry, which was confirmed 7 years ago in a pilgrimage to Greccio, Italy. And in this, he unpacks the depth and principles of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, and what Brother Keith calls the, quote, most Franciscan encyclical ever. This episode was published in December 2024, and it's a wonderful exchange about the lasting call and challenge of Pope Francis's encyclicals like Laudato Si. Enjoy. You wrote in the preface about how you spent a lot of time contemplating Laudato Si in 2017 while in Greccio. What impact did that encyclical have on your life and your work, and what opened up for you during that time in Greccio?
Well, so there had been rumors about Laudato Si as an environmental encyclical when it first, from the beginning of Pope Francis's pontificate. And so at one point I got a Skype call, yes, back when we used to use Skype, from a Franciscan friend of mine who was in Rome, and he had heard a story of there being a general audience between the leadership of the Franciscan order with the Pope and presumably Cardinal Turkson and those who were involved in writing Laudato Si. And the Pope asked if there were any Franciscans who had written about this, and our Minister General said, "Oh yes, Keith Warner, you should get some of his things." So I'd heard, he told me, this friend of mine told me that this had happened at a papal audience. Like, really, that sounds so like
no big deal.
I'm like, I read it from cover to cover right there. It's like, oh, I didn't make the footnotes. Now, in reality, this book here is quoted. This is a book about Francis of Assisi early documents. So this book is quoted properly, and clearly the people who wrote the encyclical knew, or I'm sure drafted it before Pope Francis wrote it. They knew this well. A fun fact: Peter Cardinal Turkson, who was the head of the dicastery for integral human development, did an extra theology graduate degree at a conventual seminary in upstate New York. So he got exposed to the Franciscan tradition, even though he was a diocesan priest originally from Ghana. Yeah, sure. I was on my 25th anniversary in Greccio in Franciscan Italy in 2017. But perhaps more importantly, I had read Laudato Si. I mean, I just carried it in my pack everywhere I went, and I read it dozens of times. And so I would teach from it in every class. So I was there on kind of on the side of the cliff, looking out of the Rieti Valley, and I would say that it's a beautiful location. This is, of course, where Francis had his experiences of praying the creche and kind of really founding the the process of Franciscan devotion to the Nativity, that's where the record shows that this took place. But there's this little catwalk that wrapped around the back of the friary that you could only get to through the cloister. And so I was walking back there and reading passages from Laudato Si and praying and looking out at the valley of considerable beauty. And I thought, it came to me like the balance of my religious life is to translate Laudato Si from text into life. And so that's what I do. That is kind of like a call within a call, or a clarification. That was 7 years ago. But I would just say more recently, it's like, well, Pope Francis is coming up with so many different ideas now. It's sort of like synodality, fratelli tutti. I mean, most Franciscan friars are really all in on the agenda of Pope Francis and his efforts at renewal and really fostering conversion in the world. And I'm also just conscious of last year, Pope Francis wrote Laudate Deum, which really didn't add too much to the teachings of Laudato Si. But again, read the footnotes. Here's the scholar in me. Like, he cited the U.S. bishops very early on, saying what was called for. And then at the end, he said, we can do this as long as we repent from like U.S. style lifestyles and degrees of consumption. Those were like, footnotes are political. And so those were messages that were not like direct. But if you want to understand what the Pope is thinking about, he's like saying, the America, you need to lead here. And so right now it seems like we're gearing up to lead in reverse. So, this is like we are headed on the wrong path in this country, according to the moral teachings of Pope Francis. And what's called for is repentance and conversion. I happily and joyfully join with anyone in the church who recognizes the need for that conversion. But this is not a concern of many people in America. And so this is where this message of conversion is really so important. And it's really like, we have to take it seriously. We have to act on it. And that's what's called for. And that's called for by Pope Francis, by Laudato Si, by Franciscans around the world, clear on this. But it's not a message that people want to hear or act on.
Yeah. Why is that, do you think?
Well, greed, selfishness, individualism, these blind us to others. Mm-hmm. And that's, Pope Francis introduced this concept of integral ecology, which is like this holistic understanding of human beings in relationship to God, each other, and creation, and kind of growing in our awareness, our spiritual awareness of the need for balanced and healthy give and take relationships. Doesn't mean we can't cut down a tree, but we shouldn't remove entire forests. It doesn't mean that we have to go back to living in caves, but if we adopted a lifestyle that was moderate, sober, as Pope Francis said, simple and sober, we would work our way out of this mess. But we're too addicted to our stuff, to our power, to our ability to decide for ourselves, and we're too indifferent to the suffering that this causes.
One of my favorite quotes from Thomas Merton, he's writing, he says something along the lines of, for many, and he's talking about Americans, and he says something along the lines of, for many, a tree has no reality until they cut it down. It's something along those. And I think he's getting at this need in the American mindset, at least the way I interpret it, this need in the American mindset to commodify things, and he plays a lot with this, like, hey, we'll plant a tree in the city, but we have to dedicate it to the mayor. Like that, there always has to be some kind of meaning attached. But in Franciscan spirituality and in contemplative spirituality, a lot of it comes down to relationality. Like this tree isn't something for me to commodify, something for me to give it meaning because I've cut it down now. This tree speaks to me. It speaks truth to me about who God is and how we are to renew the earth and be converted in the process. What are your thoughts on that?
2025 is both the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si, but it's also the 800th anniversary of the Canticle of the Creatures. And so, of course, many of the listeners to this podcast would be familiar with the Canticle and probably singing it in church and familiar with many of its lines. And certainly it is a beautiful and inspirational song. And it gives voice to a Franciscan care for creation in a most beautiful way. But this is another text that's really worth kind of studying and reflecting upon. I believe it's Ilya, but I'm not sure. To be honest, I don't remember the source. But I think Ilya refers to it as a Christic hymn, meaning a hymn that references Christ. And then she explains it. I'm not sure it's in this book, but I'm pretty sure she's talked about it in this way. And so I think that is really like it is other people say that it is a metaphysical statement. Okay, there's a $20 word. So it's sort of like it's describing reality that Francis perceived, not using advanced philosophical technical language, but as a song from the heart, emerging from his contemplative love of creation and his experience of God in creation. It's also, for example, the first song in modern Italian. Even so, it's not exactly that. I mean, it's unusual as reverting to the encyclical. The encyclical is from this kind of medieval Umbrian. It's not from Latin. Almost every other encyclical I know has the first words are from the Latin, and this one is from medieval Umbrian. And so that's so interesting that the Pope decided to kind of deviate, as it were, from tradition in order to embrace this and embrace it as a wisdom text. So there, again, I'm thinking about this relationality that's in the Canticle. It's really, I think, helpful for understanding Francis, who used the term brother hundreds of times, and then that sort of gives us gives me the perspective, and I hope you and your listeners as well. It's all about family, and family is the root metaphor here for understanding Francis's relationship to other people, and to earth, and to creation, and to God. So it's all about always being in relationship and thinking about others, not in this sort of like kind of doormat, milquetoast, I don't belong here, not in that kind of sense, but as a part of the family around the celebratory table, or on the outing together, or holding hands. Those are the kind of images that I think are suggested by this, both emerging from Francis's own insight, but also from it speaks to us today, and it's available to us today if we choose to lean into this way of living, this way of seeing. Right, contemplative is kind of an open-eyed prayer. This ability to lean into this as we gaze upon this kind of great tragedy of our indifference to creation, our selfishness and consumerism at the expense of it, our hard-heartedness towards the very clear suffering of creatures that are being pushed to irreversible extinction, and the suffering of the poor. So this is the conversion that Laudato Si calls us to.
I know that clip may have felt straightforward or maybe even harsh, as Brother Keith calls listeners into environmental conversion. But I really thought it was important to include here because not only is Laudato Si loaded with Franciscan wisdom, as is Fratelli Tutti, but Pope Francis himself was also unashamed to be bold and really call a spade a spade. This kind of clear and sometimes provocative communication, I think, was so important to Pope Francis as he helped move the global church toward progress, and as he challenged Catholics to adopt an ecological consciousness and care for the earth. our common home. I cannot recommend enough the book Care for Creation, written by Brother Keith, Sister Elia Delio, and Pamela Wood. The expanded edition of this book was just released and is woven with insights and wisdom from Laudato Si if you'd like to learn more about this encyclical. So lastly, this final clip includes an exchange with the poet Dr. Angela Alaimo O'Donnell about Pope Francis's deep appreciation for art and literature and the opportunity she had a couple years ago to meet Pope Francis and share her work with him. She has a wonderful article that just came out in America that I highly recommend. I'll link to that in the show notes. And this is also from an episode that will be published later this year. So without further ado, here is Dr. Angela Alaimo O'Donnell. So we're recording this on April 25th. So this is 4 days after Pope Francis passed away. And you have an article coming out any minute, you mentioned, before we hit record, in America, where you write about your love for Pope Francis and the time you were graced to meet him. So there's a really wonderful story behind that I'd love for you to get into. Can you tell us that story about meeting him, and then also about what stood out to you about his own love and appreciation for art?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a memory that goes back to almost 2 years, to May of 2023. My center was sponsoring a conference in Rome for Catholic writers from around the world, along with Georgetown University, Civital Cattolica, the great Italian Jesuit journal, and also the Hank Center at Loyola, Chicago. So we invited 40, there were between 40 and 60 writers who came to Rome and spent several days reading to each other. And we were very happy to find out that Pope Francis heard about our conference from one of our sponsors, Antonio Spadaro, who is a fellow Jesuit, and Pope Francis wanted to address us. So he wrote an address just for us. And then he invited us to the Vatican to hear the address as part of a delegation, an audience. But then he invited us up to meet him individually. So we were, as you might imagine, very excited about this possibility. It was the last day of our conference, so we all went over to the Vatican, and we went into this beautiful room. It's a room where he frequently receives people. Just monumental depictions of the life of Jesus and biblical scenes all over the walls and marble everywhere. And I was thinking to myself, like, wow, talk about the Catholic imagination at work. Like, I can only imagine what it's like to go to work every day at a place like this. Lucky Pope Francis, right? So we waited for him. He came in, he read the address to us, and the address was deeply moving. I don't think any of us realized how important literature and art has been to Francis all his life. He mentions the fact that he was a school teacher. He taught high school boys when he was in Argentina, and he thanks those kids in his address for giving him the reason, an excuse really, to read the great writers of the Western canon, to read Dostoevsky, to read Dante, and to be able to explore the regions of his own heart and soul. And these writers still mean a great deal to him spiritually. So the address was pretty short. It's really only a few paragraphs, but it's basically a very pastoral letter in which he really encourages us and enjoins us as writers to follow our imaginations. And it's very Ignatian, because Saint Ignatius of Loyola, who is one of my favorite saints because I've spent all of my adult life teaching in Jesuit universities, is a great proponent of the imagination, and so is Francis, of course, as a Jesuit. So it was just really encouraging and delightful. And the other thing about it is he was in a great mood. Um, we had heard earlier, the day before, that he had gotten sick. He had some kind of cold, so he canceled all of his appointments and all of his audiences. And so we were thinking, oh my gosh, that's it. We're not going to meet Francis. But he insisted on meeting us. And you could tell by the way he was conducting himself, this was different. We were not heads of state. We were not religious leaders. We were just writers, and I think he just delighted in meeting such ordinary people, but people who were doing something that he thought was very important. So yeah, he was ebullient. We were ebullient. It was just really a wonderful experience meeting him, and we felt as though he had really opened the door of his, not only the doors of his palace to us, but the doors of his heart to us. Yeah, it's an unforgettable moment.
And you were able to give him a couple of your poetry books, correct?
Yes, and in fact, I hope I have a copy of one of them that I gave him. It's been a book. Oh, yes, I do. I chose two books to give to him. One was my most recent book called Holy Land, which I thought this is right up the Pope's alley. He's going to love Holy Land. But the other one that I gave him is this one. It's called Saint Sinatra.
Oh,
Um,
that's awesome.
and you can see, and this book, the theme of this book is the blessedness and holiness of artists, because they give us beauty, and
Hmm.
beauty is the instantiation of goodness in the world. And if the test case is Sinatra, because if there's room for Sinatra in the communion of saints, there's room for all of us, right? So I have Frank's mugshot superimposed over Frangelico's Procession of the Saints, and
Hmm.
as soon as Pope Francis looked at the cover, he laughed. And I knew he would, because he has a great sense of humor. And so hopefully he read a poem or two. I don't know. I was hoping one of the poems would show up in one of his homilies, but that didn't happen, at least not to my knowledge. But he received our gifts very graciously, and yeah, so it was really a great day.
Yeah, that's an amazing experience you were able to have. I went through and I read his address that you linked to in your America article, and oh my gosh, there are just some really stunning quotes. And I wanted to get your reaction to one of them, and you include this in your article. Pope Francis said, "This then is your task as poets, storytellers, filmmakers, and artists, to give life, flesh, and verbal expression to all that humanity experiences, feels, dreams, and endures, thus creating harmony and beauty. This evangelical task also helps us come to a deeper understanding of God as the great poet of humanity." What does that quote mean to you? What did his address that he spoke directly to you all, what did that mean to you that day?
Yes, that was one of the standout quotations. Pope Francis is very quotable, and and there are a bunch in there that are great, but that's one of my favorites. What we all, I think, immediately recognize is Francis understands art, and he understands poetry, and he knows what poetry does. We don't talk about God or about Jesus or about the Holy Spirit. Like, we instantiate God, the Holy Spirit and Jesus in the work that we do. This is not theology, it's not philosophy, it's not an ology at all. It is a made thing, an artifact, hopefully a beautiful artifact, whether it's a painting or a sculpture or a piece of music, a film or a poem, in which we see God when we experience the divine in the process of reading the poem or looking at the statue or watching the film. And Francis gets that, this idea of enfleshment, this idea of making palpable for people to feel and touch and taste and smell God. And Francis, of course, is famous for his wonderful expressions that talk about enfleshment. Remember, one of his directives to priests and pastors when he first became pope was like, go out among the people so you get the smell of the sheep on you, which is just such a lovely expression, because the fact is, a shepherd, the sheep know his smell and he knows their smell, and that sort of elemental connection to the real. The Catholic writer Flannery O'Connor talks about the artist lives his or her life hotly in pursuit of the real. And Francis always struck me as somebody whose feet were firmly on the ground. He was very much in pursuit of the real. We've had other marvelous popes who were scholars, and sort of lived a very heady kind of intellectual life. That was not Francis. He was somebody who lived, was much more earthbound, like us writers, because we're pretty earthbound in many ways, even though poets have this reputation for being like, prophetic and sort of otherworldly. Really, we're pretty earthy people.
Yeah, yeah, the famous quote about being able the scent, the smell of the shepherd and the sheep. I mean, it's so visceral, as in the Franciscan world, we really connect that to Saint Francis of Assisi and this incarnational spirituality, but it's really like you said, it's a really beautiful thing to have a pope who is so down to earth and earthy, like you said. It's a great word. I mean, someone who's about experience and yeah. It's a. I cannot believe that you were able to have that experience there with a bunch of other artists with him.
Yes,
It's
yes,
incredible.
it really was incredible. And I will mention, just to drop a name, besides Pope Francis's name, one of the people who's with us was Martin Scorsese. And it was so charming to watch the two of those, because here they are, both men in their 80s, right? Both still at the height of their powers, and they were like schoolboys. Scorsese was obviously so delighted to meet Pope Francis, and Pope Francis was so delighted to meet him. And so there was just something about the, and Scorsese, of course, is a very, very famous Catholic artist, and somebody whose work is very, it's very contemporary, and it also is very controversial. And here's Francis. Francis embraces everybody. Here's Francis, embracing him. Everybody brought the Pope a gift, but the gift that Scorsese brought this was just before his film, The Killers of the Flower Moon, came out, which is about the Osage people. So his gift to Pope Francis was a calligraphied copy of the Our Father written in the Osage language.
Oh, wow.
So it's just so perfect, such a beautiful, irreplaceable gift. Who else would do that, and why? So that was also very touching to witness that coming together of these two. In fact, those of us who were not famous people often refer to that day that we met Francis as the day we met the two popes.
That's great.
Yeah, so it was really a lovely day, not just for those of us who are less well known writers, but even for people who were very well known. Like they knew Scorsese knew I'm in the presence of greatness, and I'm very humbled by it. Yeah.
That concludes our special episode on the life, legacy, and papacy of Pope Francis. To learn more, I encourage you to visit the show notes in the description of this episode on whichever platform that you listen to this podcast. So rest in peace, Pope Francis, and please, as Father Murray said, pray for us. After the music, you'll hear Pope Francis's own quotations about God's mercy, an undeniable cornerstone of his papacy. One of these quotes, as you'll hear, was recorded after Easter several years ago, which I found fitting. Thanks for listening to Off the Page. Peace and all good.
I will lead you into the desert with me and tenderly speak to your heart.
Be an architect of mercy. Whoever experiences divine mercy is impelled to be an architect of mercy among the least and the poor. In these littlest brothers, Jesus awaits us. See Matthew chapter 25, verse 40. Let us receive mercy, and let us give mercy. Let us go to the encounter, and let us celebrate Easter in the joy of God. Homily, St. Peter's Basilica, Friday, March 28, 2014. Pope Francis at Pontifex, October 7, 2013. Mercy is the true power that can save humanity and the world from sin and evil. Mercy has triumphed. The Church, throughout the world, echoes the angel's message to the women. Do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here, for he has been raised. Come, see the place where he lay. Matthew chapter 28, verses 5 and 6. This is the culmination of the gospel. It is the good news par excellence. Jesus, who was crucified, is risen. This event is the basis of our faith and our hope. If Christ were not raised, Christianity would lose its very meaning. The whole mission of the Church would lose its impulse, for this is the point from which it first set out and continues to set out ever anew. The message which Christians bring to the world is this: Jesus, love incarnate, died on the cross for our sins. But God the Father raised him and made him the Lord of life and death. In Jesus, love has triumphed over hatred, mercy over sinfulness, goodness over evil, truth over falsehood, life over death. Urbi et Orbi, Loggia of St. Peter's Basilica, Sunday, April 20th, 2014.